So good morning, everybody. Just to, Ilse's presentation will be in English. So just to let you know that Ilse Geijzendorffer, she's working in Tour du Valat. She's a senior researcher there. She's a theoretical mathematical biologist. Yeah, I got it. And she's working in two large Horizon 2020 European projects. One of them is Ecopotential, and UBO is also a partner there. And the other one is called SWOS, and they're both dealing with the use of remote sensing to assess ecosystem services in different types of ecosystems. She came here to be part of the jury of Perrine's master thesis, and we took the opportunity to ask her also to give us a short seminar about what she's doing with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I will give her the floor.
Thank you, Valat, for that introduction. I think that some of the work I'll show you is of my research ex at the Tour de Valat, and some of the work is work that Valat is also involved in the GeoBon working group on ecosystem services. So thank you for the presentation. So as you can see, I'm typically Mediterranean. For the podcast, I'm tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. I come from the Netherlands originally. I've been in France for 4 years now. Donc je parle parfaitement français, entre guillemets. Donc si vous souhaitez de poser des questions en français, n'hésitez pas. But I prepared indeed the presentation in English because that's just a bit easier. So since the 1st of June this year, I work for the Tour de Valat. And just to say a few words of what the Tour de Valat is, it's a private scientific research organization, which is quite rare. And we work on the conservation of Mediterranean wetlands. And we're basically situated here where our flag is in the Camargue, just south of Arles, which is a river delta of the Rhone. And we are a long-term biodiversity observation site, and we collaborate with a whole network of sites and partners around the Mediterranean Sea, as you can see here. Now, this is a very great area to work for biodiversity conservation. The Mediterranean Basin is a biodiversity hotspot globally. And due to the Mediterranean climate, a lot of the biodiversity that we have that is so special is related to water, surface water. And that means that a lot of the biodiversity is actually related to the wetlands. And in really recent years, since 2012 for the first time, we have a first estimate of how much wetlands there actually is in the Mediterranean, which is for us a huge leap forward, but I realize that we might be a bit behind with some of our other biomes globally, so we're hoping to make rapid progress, amongst others, through remote sensing of habitat extent in the projects that Valat just mentioned. So we have a few challenges in the Mediterranean, in case you haven't seen the news recently. But from a scientific perspective, one of obviously the biggest challenges is going to be the water availability, which on the one hand is limiting for a biodiversity that is currently so special in the region, but at the same time it is really a problem for sustainable development from an anthropogenic point of view, with food demands rising, people rising, a lot of migration, urbanization ongoing. So we think that in the future this scarcity will just increase unless we develop a more positive future scenario. And especially for wetlands, land cover changes are rather irreversible. Once it's agriculture, it's very difficult to get the kind of soil conditions back that would permit for wetlands as they currently are. And what we've seen in recent publications like the Newbold paper, which you probably have seen, is that many Mediterranean wetland habitats are considered to currently have exceeded the safety boundaries for biodiversity. And on top of that, the Mediterranean basin is considered to be vulnerable for ecosystem services supply towards the future. So basically this is a challenge. We are with 60 people working on this with our colleagues in the Mediterranean basin, but we really welcome any possibility for collaboration. So this is an open invitation. We have great student facilities. We have really a nice campus. We can do field work, which I think a really nice place, but I'm a bit biased because... So I have a research ex at the Tour de Valat, which is for the ecosystem services, and basically I'm working on 3 different things. So the first one is to try to link what we know about biodiversity and habitat extent to ecosystem services supply, which is on its own already a knowledge gap currently in literature. And then what we try to do is to compare how much services the actual wetlands provide comparison to other kinds of habitats and other kinds of biodiversity in the Mediterranean. And then we try to push this knowledge into the relevant scientific and international policy bodies. So just to give you an example of some of our work, we did a first estimate of how much services are actually being supplied in the Mediterranean basin and how that changed in the recent past, so last 20 years. And what we did is it's a methodology that's very often applied, so we basically just looked at how land cover has changed in the last 20 years for Europe and Northeast. And we multiplied this by a supply capacity matrix, which is basically based on experts saying forest provides about a 5 for timber, but about a 2 for wild foods like mushrooms. And then if you multiply the two, you get, on the one hand, you can get maps of distributions of different ecosystem services, and on the other hand, you can get changes in ecosystem services bundles, where the different ecosystem services are on the vertical axis. So if you do that, this is your picture. It's not very nice, right? So on the left, you can see our European Mediterranean countries because they had a different kind of spatial resolution, so that's why they're separate. And what you can see is that most of the services are going down. And especially if you look at the services that are very important for human well-being into the future, these are the services that are related with either food production or water availability. So this is a real concern, which is why I was interested in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was wondering, okay, so we have these Sustainable Development Goals, and the problem with this method is that they're actually so based on land cover extent and not on the actual state of the ecosystem. So it means, for instance, for marine areas, the extent doesn't really change that much, so you capture no change in ecosystem service supply from marine areas. And you also do not catch any kind of change in ecosystem services that result from biodiversity degradation. So these for us are two very relevant aspects that we would like to address. So for the Sustainable Development Goals, I wondered, so is it going to help? So on the one hand, it might, because the Mediterranean basin does not have a uniform governance structure. So a lot of the ecosystem services research might take place in units that have one governance structure, whether it's like Europe, that at least we have some habitats directives or some bird directives. The Mediterranean basin doesn't have that. So international policies for us help us join forces and mobilize funds from governance and protection status for wetlands. So the Sustainable Development Goals is the follow-up of the Millennium Development Goals, and the current phase of this policy objective is that it's actually looking for indicators and trying to validate indicators now. And in the future, at least for the first reporting, it's the national statistical bureaus that are supposed to report. So basically you get data at national level. So at first instance, when we look at the potential for Sustainable Development Goals, it looks very promising because 193 UN member states signed the agreement, so that's good. So we've got general support for the set, and it's really impressive. It's a really impressive set of integrated objectives. But if we look a bit closer, there are 17 goals, which are always presented, but it's divided in 169 sub-goals. And countries can actually sort of choose which of the objectives they might or might not invest in. So we risk getting really dispersed. And on top of that, especially for water and for biodiversity, trade-offs are not included. So you could have countries in theory that say, I'm going to advance my food production and I'm going to try to address malnutrition. But if that comes at a price of lower water availability, lower water quality, it's currently not visible. So here's what we did. So I was interested in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also Sustainable Development Goals from policies in general. So we looked at the Sustainable Development Goals in the Aichi targets, and we looked at which ecosystem services are actually mentioned, and also with which frequency. Now, in order to not overestimate what we found, we didn't count vague terms like essential ecosystem services or sustainable development on its own. And then we compared this to variables of ecosystem services flows. And I will come back to this framework later, but this is also work ongoing in the GeoBond work group. And then in order to know, okay, this is the information that is actually demanded on ecosystem services, but will we be actually able to supply it? We looked at 10 different national ecosystem services assessments to see what kind of information is typically available. between brackets typically. So I'm just going to dive straight into the results because they're always interesting. So this is the result of a network analysis. So the thickness of the line says how often that ecosystem service was mentioned in a specific target. And we group them per ecosystem service category: provisioning, regulating, and cultural. What you see is that especially the provisioning service is very often mentioned, especially in two objectives, so the Sustainable Development Goal 2 and Aichi Target B. Then regulating service apparently is very often mentioned, with the cultural being least mentioned, although it is mentioned, let's say, once in quite a lot of different targets. So just in case you do not have, you do not know by heart which target is which. So the Sustainable Development Goal 2 is really focused on ending hunger. So the link to the provisioning service, which provides food and energy, is a logical one. And Aichi Target B is to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and to promote sustainable use. So at least my interpretation is that it's very logical that it uses both indicators from the regulating services and the provisioning services. If we look at the actual ecosystem services individually, then we look at the top 25% of all the ecosystem services mentioned, we can see that there's quite a nice spread over the three categories. And for me, as a surprise, because I thought that both targets would be much more oriented either on provisioning service or on real biodiversity, more like ecosystem functioning, the first service that pops up is natural heritage and diversity. This one is the most often named across these two documents. And then we have capture fisheries and agriculture. Water purification is the first regulating service that pops up in this top 25. Then we have crops, livestock, and finally cultural heritage and diversity. So I find this quite encouraging to see that these two documents at least cover quite a nice range across the three different ecosystem service categories. So the next step then is, okay, so what are the information are they actually asking and using? So if we look at Sustainable Development Goal 2 on ending hunger, a very logical indicator for this target is food production in tons per hectare, which is currently included in the list. So if a country would like to address or to progress towards this target, it might say, okay, we're going to put investments so that we can increase the management efficiency so that the production efficiency goes up. So the results could be that the food per hectare, the amount of food produced per hectare increases. So in theory that looks very good, but the problem is what happens if your population additionally increases? Because that's really what ending hunger or malnutrition is about, that each of your individuals has enough to eat. And if you look at that in terms of, so this is just a world map, for instance, for Africa, we're not sure that we're getting there. So it means that just having an indicator on food production, which is more readily available, might not be enough. So this led me to a previous publication which developed a framework on which aspects of an ecosystem services flow do you need to know in order to see if there's any mismatches. So I'm just going to go through it for the ecosystem service, soil erosion prevention. I'm starting at the bottom. So the potential supply really includes, let's say, all the ecological aspects, the ecological structure, ecological functioning. So you could think of the soil covering vegetation for how many months in the year. And then the supply includes the co-production. So it includes the human management interventions. So for instance, now your service gets topped up by the fixation of soil by terraces. And then the use by the society can be considered, for instance, as the actual soil erosion that is being prevented by the combination of these two. So it means that you also take into account the pressure, for instance, if it's on a slope. Then, if we consider the demand, we could say that, okay, it has to be really explicitly expressed, so not asking people, would you like soil erosion to stop? Because they will say yes, but it has no relation with how much money they have and how important it is for them. So here you see a lot of, let's say, our economic indicators coming back. And for instance, you can also quantify them in different ways, like the soil eroded on agricultural lands, which actually impacts the natural capital farmers have. And then the last one, which is very often used in policy documents, is the implementation of governance measures, but not necessarily just in terms of obligations or limits, but also in stimulation and awareness, for instance, for the uptake of good soil practices. So this is one of the inputs that is currently in the ongoing work of the Global Earth Observation Biodiversity Observation Network. I don't know why there's so often observation in that title, but it's the Ecosystem Services Working Group from the GEOBON. But we have currently evolved this, and it now includes quite a lot more economic, sociologic, anthropologic variables. But I use this one because I find this, at least for our work, the most relevant. So here's then what you get. So these are the indicators that are being proposed for the monitoring of these two policy documents and the different kinds of information that they're asking for. And what you see is that the Aichi targets are very much oriented to the supply side, so either the ecological or the co-production side of ecosystem services, and also a few on use, whereas the interest and demand, so let's say more the societal and economic part, are much less represented, and that the sustainable development goals are much more nicely equally distributed over these 5 different categories of ecosystem services knowledge. If we look at, so what happens very often is that we write nice reports on these policy objective documents. They also have a very highly political, strategical value, which means that sometimes they state objectives and they ask for indicators that we cannot necessarily supply. So what we did here is to see, okay, from the actual reporting, comparing it to what was actually demanded in the policy documents originally, what would be the difference? So we cannot do that for the Sustainable Development Goals because they're currently in the state of looking forward to their first reporting. But for this Aichi targets, we can do that. So for the Sustainable Development Goals, we see a quite nicely distributed demand over the 5 different variables, except for maybe that there is not a lot of demand for supply. Whereas as you see for the Aichi targets, there's quite a high demand of indicators for, let's say, more the ecological side of ecosystem services, which then really sort of, I'm not going to say crashes, but it really reduces on the social side of the variables. And if you then compare it to the used indicators, so this is the indicators that are used in the Global Biodiversity Outlook 4, we can see that, for me at least surprisingly, we do not deliver a lot of the potential supply indicators, whereas I thought that, well, maybe I'm a biologist, that we were getting there with essential biodiversity variables and that we could really well provide a lot of information, which is apparently not the case. And we see that the bias towards the social indicators is even worse now than it was before. So then the final results of this analysis, so we looked into 10 different national ecosystem services assessments, which led to 277 indicators over about, I think, 31 different ecosystem services. And what we can see here, so this is the amount of information that we're actually supplying or might be able to supply for these kinds of reporting. We see that most of our indicators are on supply for provisioning services. And this is probably not a surprise. I mean, just if you look at the regulating, it's more linked to the potential supply, so that's a lot linked to more ecological indicators. And we see that use, demand, and interest, they're much less well covered, and especially cultural services are really not doing well in capturing those in those national assessments. So this is just to show you, I mean, I'm not asking you to read all the different services that were mentioned, but this is just to show you that all the graphs that I've now shown, they're sort of aggregated in different dimensions. But you have to realize that for individual ecosystem services in individual assessments, you might get 2 indicators capturing 2 out of 5 of the different elements you might want to know of an ecosystem service. And most of these indicators talking hopefully about something like supply or potential supply and use. So it's really limited knowledge that we have for individual ecosystem services. So based on these observations, what we conclude currently is that it's great that all the ecosystem services categories are mentioned. It means that we have made great steps in an integrated view on what is important for sustainable development. But it's clear that ecosystem service is not the same as demand, and that we're going to run into problem in the reporting and interpreting of these reports for sustainable development. Currently, there's no indicators and trade-offs, not in the policy documents, not in the national ecosystem services assessments. So for instance, for our wetlands, this is going to be a problem because we will not be able to highlight that we're at the end of the pipeline of the river and it's not going well. Ecological functioning of ecosystems was not often mentioned in the policy documents for sustainable development and also not in the national assessment, which is really a pity because I think we have more information there that could be included, but there might need to be some more interactions or maybe some more propositions. And finally, a lot of the indicators are not spatially or beneficiary specific. That means that if you have a national average on how much food is available and what the average food available for one person is, that might mean that specific ethnic groups, gender groups, or in the case of water, people at the bottom of the water pipeline not getting enough water will not necessarily become visible. So we're not there yet, but we see a lot of activities ongoing in the frame of IPBES and the Sustainable Development Goals. And well, showing this now, we hope also that people start thinking, for instance, about trade-offs and proposing things of how it could be included. What you do have to realize is that the Sustainable Development Goals is a very political document, which is one of the reasons why trade-offs are not included as an objective, right? Because some countries, maybe all countries, do not necessarily want to know if they're not doing very well in one area because they increased in another. So I don't think that if we wait for the policies to formulate trade-offs, we can wait a long time. So I'm really hoping that the scientists also in this room will contribute to that debate and to that knowledge. So I'll just leave you with that, and I'm happy also to talk to about other work that we did in our Research X on ecosystem services. And I just want to highlight the Mediterranean Ecosystem Services Working Group that I chair in the frame of the Ecosystem Services Partnership. And if anyone wants to join us, you're very welcome. We already have some people on coastal ecosystems and ecosystem services, so it would be great if you could join us. And we'll be, amongst others, discussing in Antwerp next week, where Valat also will be there. So thank you very much for your attention.